This is Red Ice Radio. From the dream to reality. RedIceCreations.com.
Welcome, my name is Henrik Palmgren. We're glad to have you all with us today. I hope you're well wherever you are around the globe. They came to Earth millions of years ago to spread the poison of hatred, war, and catastrophe. And they are still with us. Human history is a seemingly endless succession of bloody conflicts and devastating turmoil. Yet inexplicably, in the light of astonishing intellectual and technological advancement, man's progress has been halted in one crucial area. He still indulges the primitive beast within and makes war upon his neighbors. As a result of 7 years of intense research, William Bramley has uncovered the sinister thread that links humanity's darkest events, from the wars of the ancient pharaohs to the assassination of JFK. In his remarkable, shocking and absolutely compelling work, Bramley presents disturbing evidence of an alien presence on Earth, extraterrestrial visitors who have conspired to dominate humankind through violence and chaos since the beginning of time, a conspiracy which continues to this very day. William Bramley began his writing career at the age of 26 when he began the research that would culminate into his first book, The Gods of Eden. And he is with us today to discuss war, colonization, humanity and ET, alien abductees and apocalyptic religions. Is humanity heading for a wipeout through famine, plagues and a diminishing food supply? The human family might be heading down the road of extinction. It's with great pleasure that we welcome you to Red Ice Radio, William Bramley. Thank you for coming on the program. It's good to have you with us. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. It's my great pleasure to be on the show.
Absolutely. It's my treat, so to speak. I've been aware of your work in terms of the Gods of Eden for a long time. It's been a primary source, if you will, in terms of a lot of the ideas and things that we've been discussing on this program for a long time. So this is going to be a real treat for me as well. But why don't you at the outset just tell us and our listeners who might not be familiar, William, with your work and specifically your book, The Gods of Eden, kind of where you began, I guess, a little bit, and then we can move on to talk about some of the material contained in the book, William.
Yeah, I actually I was a sociology major as a university student. I always had this interest in what causes war, what the solutions to war might be. And one of the ideas that has come up is the idea that there are people who profit from war, either politically or economically. And so what I really started off to do was to do kind of a research study on who profits, how they profit, and maybe what some of the solutions are, maybe ways to take profit out of war, for example, deprofitizing war-making industries, that type of idea. So I started researching it, and what happened, though, was the one thing I couldn't find a profit motive in were most of the people who actually participate in war, the people who will actually pick up the guns and start shooting other people. Then you get into, well, what motivates them to do something so obviously self-destructive to themselves and to people around them. One of the aspects of it became religion. I think we're well aware of the way that religion can sometimes trigger a motivation to go to war. So then I thought, well, there's a certain type of religion that seems to instigate this the most, and that's this sort of radical, apocalyptic kind of religion. For some reason, that has a psychological effect on people, on many people anyway, that can make them very agitated and make them go to war with somebody else that they think is the enemy on the other side spiritually. So then that got to, okay, well, where do these beliefs come from? Where do these apocalyptic beliefs have their origin? From there, then you get into, of course, these old texts, the old Hebrew texts and the Christian texts and even the Quran to some extent. Then the question is, well, who started these? And of course, you have the usual answers. You have Moses, you have Jesus, you have Muhammad. Well, where did they say they got their ideas? Because they're so similar. I mean, these ideas, did they just copy each other or what happened? And now you get into, well, they claim that there were these angels or there were these heavenly beings that came down and gave them these messages. that's the point where most historians draw the line. They say, okay, well, now we've entered the world of myth, that obviously these stories about angels and heavenly beings can't be true. That's just a mythology. But then you run into Eric von Daniken and Zecharia Sitchin, who say, well, maybe there was some truth to that. Maybe they weren't lying about that. They just called it something different. Then you get into the ancient astronaut hypothesis. So then I went down that track, and then you get to the source of these back in ancient Sumerian culture, our very earliest creation texts, which talk about, this human-like race coming here to Earth, creating Homo sapiens to basically be a work race. And part of those creation stories talk about their intention or desire to keep humanity disunited as basically a tool of control. Now, as a university student, I read Machiavelli, which all sociology and political science majors eventually do.
Right.
It'll be on an assignment list to read The Prince. And where one of the tools that people have used throughout history to keep political control is you create factions, you foment, you have a subjugated population, and you get them to go to war with each other. That distracts them from the fact that you are their subjugator, and they keep thinking that their issues are with each other. So that became then the model for this book, and I basically I went back in history, then I worked my way forward again, because there were certain types of organizations that did the most to promote these kinds of philosophies, these sort of divisive, apocalyptic philosophies. And they had certain origins in common, certain organizational structures in common. And then I followed through from back in history coming up to the present day, seeing that, these same organizations with these same origins continue to be the source of this type of apocalyptic belief that then eventually fomented war and other factors that then caused us to have all of these problems. Basically, we're just in a state of constant distraction with each other because of all of these issues. And that became the theory then of the gods of Eden.
Absolutely, and I guess I want to try to get to the root of where some of these ideas come from, then where they stem from, and how I guess again the interface between some of these biblical and other Islamic deities and so forth as well that you mentioned, patriarchs, if you will, where basically they got some of these ideas from, and if they can be interpreted as being kind of literal, I guess in one sense, Moses going up to a mountain, talking with something that seems to be radiating, if you will, and is coming down with the law. It's like the whole saga, if you will, almost begin at that point. Maybe there is an earlier, William, that you can talk about, but that seems to be kind of the inception happening right there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. You can go back to the earlier Sumerian creation stories, and here I recommend the books of Zecharia Sitchin. I think he did a wonderful job interpreting some of these books. But there they talk about basically a leadership in these extraterrestrial entities. And for example, the Old Testament tribe of Abraham, when they started in the Sumerian region, and they took some of the Sumerian creation stories and rewrote them to fit their religion, but there seemed to be a constant connection to the UFO phenomenon even with them. You read in the Old Testament that the tribes, they were led by this fire in the sky that was metallic looking. It gave off smoke. I mean, it's the classic description of a rocket ship that would then land on a mountaintop that only a few of the top leaders could go up and meet with them. And that's where they eventually got the commandments and they got some of their beliefs. And then you have the prophets like Ezekiel. That's very famous in UFO literature. They talk about the wheels within the wheels. And so there were direct contacts with prophets within that religion that seemed to have a UFO connection. And of course, Ezekiel was given that kind of a message. He was basically given an apocalyptic kind of message. And part of the apocalyptic belief that they instilled was, okay, we are God's chosen and nobody else is. And then the Christians came along, and you see, of course, in the New Testament, that all of the Star of Bethlehem. Now, some people think that was an alignment of planets and stars, which is a pretty good theory. But when you look into the Apocrypha, you see descriptions of the Star of Bethlehem, which is much more like a moving object in the sky that becomes stationary and moves around. So you still have that continuing contact, and you keep finding it. When Muhammad had his vision in the cave, which led to Islam, to many people that looks like a typical abduction phenomenon, where you're paralyzed, you have these entities, they impart a message, and then they leave. And then whoever was given that message then goes out and starts this new religion. And one thing I like to tell people is that really most of our major religions started off as UFO cults. That's really what they were. Some made it big, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Even Hinduism, I think we can perhaps characterize a little bit as a UFO cult that made it big.
Sure.
Yeah, and then some don't. They just stay very small or marginalized and vanish. So that seems to be, to a large extent, the history of human religion.
So, I mean, that's pretty, earth-shattering, so to speak. If we do have an ET, an extraterrestrial civilization, we might even actually be talking about several ones then, William, who are, if you will, competing for the attention of mankind for whatever reason, and we can get into why that would be later on. But if that is the case, then what do you think is the purpose of that? Is it to instigate, the war and the strife and the things that you mentioned here at the beginning, basically to keep humanity in a form of a enslaved state?
That is the stated intention when you go look at the old creation stories. When you look at, for example, I talk about the Tower of Babel story. Now, the Tower of Babel story in the Bible is based upon an earlier creation story, which involved the many gods, not just the one God that they turned it into later when they created the Old Testament books. So yeah, the whole idea was to basically keep people in a form of disunity as a tool of control. And people ask me, well, why would they still be doing that today? Why would it have gone on so long? For example, Sitchin talks about that there was a purpose to humanity, that was to do labor, to do mining, to do building, to do construction. So there was a definite purpose behind it. That stopped, and what happened was the UFO then sort of went into the background, rather than being open and visible in human society, which our ancient ancestors claimed that they were. So what would the purpose be in that? Here, I don't have any really good, strong idea on that. I mean, I just can throw out a few possibilities. For example, you just hang on to a possession. If you own a piece of property, you keep it. For example, the British Empire kept a lot of their islands long after they were no longer useful for shipping because we started having airplanes and so forth. But right. They still kept control. They still kept the same form. They still kept governance over some of these Atlantic islands, even though they really had no practical use anymore. So there's just a tendency just to sort of hang on to things. And if habitable planets are as rare as perhaps they seem to be, and you have one, for example, here on Earth, we seem to be the only habitable planet anywhere in our solar system, and probably maybe in this section of the galaxy. You just kind of want to keep it. And if you have inhabitants on there, you need to basically just keep control over them the way you've always done, even though your purpose in doing that may have shifted. So that's just one theory, and I can only throw it out. People have other ideas, and I just encourage people, if they're intrigued by these concepts, to explore them and maybe to come up with ideas of their own on why that might be happening. Absolutely,
because, I mean, the question that is going a little bit back and forth here as well is in terms of how much they have been part of, seeding us or creating us, even in some cases. If we go back to some texts, they seem to suggest that humankind was made by them in one way or another, either if that's through, genetic engineering or a complete seeding, if you will, of mankind. But you've talked about this idea of custodial society, right? That the ETR consider themselves to be the custodians of Earth and mankind, and kind of, connected with this idea is that Earth is kind of almost quarantined, if you will, by them as well. We're not allowed to do certain things, or maybe even not, get off the planet, if you will, William. How do you perceive some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to them. I think one of the favorite quotes in my book is from Charles Fort. Charles Fort wrote a book called The Book of the Damned back in 1919. He was just looking into anomalous phenomenon like frogs falling out of the sky and things we would call UFOs today, and he collected them into a couple of volumes. One was called Book of the Damned, and another one was called Low. And he wrote, I thought, a very good, succinct statement about what he thought. And this was back before we entered the space age. This was quite a long time ago. And he said, I think we're property. I think we're owned by something, all others warned off. I think that was a tremendous point of intuition on his part, because that seems to be the case. There is sort of evidence that, that something else controls it, that these things that are flying around in our sky that we call UFOs today, that seem to abduct people, that have been reported for thousands of years, we kind of, as human beings, we think, well, this is our planet and they're visiting us. But from their point of view, it's, hey, this is our planet, meaning it belongs to these ETs, and we just happen to be the life forms that are on here that perhaps they had a role in creating many thousands of years ago, or even maybe millions of years ago, depending on what theory you want to follow. So from their point of view, they may very well feel that they really do own this planet, and that we are the cattle, which is a word that Charles Fort used in his, he basically refers to human beings as a form of livestock. It's kind of insulting. I mean, I have a higher opinion of us as human beings than that, but from the perspective of a much more advanced race, that might be how they look at us to some extent, basically intelligent livestock.
Right. And that would suggest in one way that this is about, nutrition actually in one form or another, right? And the question is it the flesh and blood that they're after, or is it the energy of the soul, if you will? I mean, again, I've heard so many different theories connecting with this in terms of even the reincarnation cycle being kind of a mechanism, if you will, maybe even a technology of sorts to keep humanity coming back and back and back again. And it's almost like the energy of the soul, or even the suffering of what many people are experiencing on this planet, is being used for something else, William.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory, and it's not one that I really developed in my book. It's something that I've heard people express after I published The Gods of Eden. Of course, got a little bit more involved in knowing people who were doing this kind of research. Yeah, the idea that we as life forms, we give off energy, and certain emotions give off certain types of energy, and perhaps that there is some form of energy that comes out of fear, that comes out of strife, that comes out of this, that somehow they feed off energetically. Maybe, and if it relates to the rebirth cycle that you talked about, I think there's very good evidence that we are a consciousness that survives the death of the body, and there's been some good near-death studies, I think, done on that. That process in between with this entity of light and the amnesia, that maybe it's connected to the UFO. And there are a couple of ancient books. Well, they're not that ancient. They're from like around 200 AD. These are the books of Enoch. These are Old Testament Apocrypha, where the books of Enoch talk about the prophet there being taken to somewhere in outer space. And there are all the souls of the dead who are somehow being judged and processed. And he talks about something that really sounds like this entity of light that people report, in their near-death experiences, that somehow that this involves a processing that's going on, and but he doesn't really talk about reincarnation per se. That seems to be evidence coming from somewhere else. There's a good professor over at the University of Virginia who is very famous. I think his name is Ian Stevenson. I forgot the name. But anyway, he's done, his university tolerated him running off to India to do all of these studies on people, children especially, who claimed memories of past lives. And he did a great job documenting all of this. And he came to the conclusion that, reincarnation probably is real, that there is some kind of process whereby people are reborn, but there's an amnesia, obviously, that happens in between. So, but is there something that they gain from that? You know, the theory here is that when you look at, for example, the old creation stories of the Popol Vuh, which is the ancient American creation story. Now, it's very mythologized, by the way. You know, you can't take it all literally. But it has a core belief that's reflected into the old Sumerian stories that in order to have a functioning body, you had to sort of attach a consciousness to it, that the body won't function without it. And so part of engineering the human body, they had to create a body to which a consciousness could be attached and stay attached. Otherwise it wouldn't work. And so I think that maybe that practical. I think you had Dr. David Jacobs on your show maybe a couple years ago.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, I really respect his work, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about what he's gotten into.
Yeah.
But, you know, he talked about one episode where he had an abductee who was let go after the abduction experience, and he got hit by a car right afterwards. Okay. What happened was apparently the UFO returned and picked him up, and then the way it was described was they actually got him as a soul and kind of took him out of his body, and then I guess did some kind of healing work and then put the soul back and then let him go. Now, Dr. Jacobs didn't really believe that story because he really hadn't heard it before. I believe that story simply because it's probably pretty rare that people have an accident right after they've been abducted. So it's not going to happen very often. But the reason I take that story very seriously is that in my newer book, the Jesus Goes to Hollywood, I have a chapter kind of on the UFO and Jesus. And there I found some apocryphal books which talk about that exact same thing being done to Mary, Mother Mary, where she's taken as a soul out of her body by these entities and then put into a container as a soul and moved away. So there seems to be this ability or this understanding in these ETs of how the soul works to some extent, that it is separate. It's something you can remove. It's something you can move. It's something you can put back. That doesn't mean that their moral values are necessarily high. People think, well, geez, if you have that level of understanding about the soul or the consciousness, that automatically equates to, well, then probably your morality must be very high to have that understanding. I think the evidence is not that way.
Right.
You know, morality is a whole separate issue from understanding the mechanics of these types of things. So they understand the mechanics, but I'm not sure that they have the morality to really deal with it the way we would like them to do.
I mean, it almost suggests as well, William, that what we're talking about is a kind of a spiritual abduction. I'm not saying I'm trying to discount the phenomena of not being physical. They could still be coming here with a craft and so forth. But if I mean, again, we can't even begin to speculate in terms of what kind of technology they have, depending on how far ahead they are of us, right? But at the same time, it seems to suggest that it's kind of it's more of a spiritual thing. They want to take the soul out of your body in that sense, right? It's when it suits their purpose, or put the soul into the body when it suits their purpose. So yeah, it's that ability to take the soul in and take it out. That seems to be what they have an understanding of, at least if we're to believe some of the UFO abduction scenarios, and even going back earlier to some of the old religious texts. That seems to be a concept that they seem to be able to deal with. And again, it could just be a very practical thing. You know, if you're going to have bodies running around, you need to have souls attached to them. And it could be something just that pedantic. Because one thing I think Dr. Jacobs talked about is he didn't really see in his studies any particularly high spiritual level necessarily. I mean, well, I you know, you've talked to him, probably he expressed it much better. But you kind of see that in the UFO abduction scenario. Yeah, they'll come across sometimes and impart these spiritual messages. They say, you know, you be good to each other and all of that. And a lot of people connect this concept of spiritual understanding to UFOs.
But I'm not sure if it's really the type that we would necessarily impart, like the spirituality of a Buddhist, for example. I think is very different than maybe the spirituality of one of these ET abductors. So, as you can tell, I haven't really explored it probably as deeply as it can be explored. And here I think it comes into looking very closely at the abduction literature, really digging through all the stories and what have people talked about and kind of coming up with a conclusion. A lot of the abduction research that's been done, and it's been very good research, is pretty much into the mechanics of it. Like what happens, when does it happen, where are they taken, they're poked and they're probed, they're experimented with, and they're put back. And maybe they're given a message, and that message is part of it. But there's not a lot of looking into necessarily, well, what are the total spiritual implications of this, which I think would make a fascinating area of study, and I think there's a lot more that could be done with that data.
Absolutely. I mean, William, if the point is to control humanity in one way or another, there have to be an interface, obviously, between them and us, because we can't see them openly, anyway, ruling us, right? We have other factions that is doing that. If we talk about the military, for instance, or the wars, if we tie it back to that, we still have, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know anyway, we have human, generals and unless they're possessed or something like that. But again, that goes back to this idea. What do you think the interface here is? Is it a philosophy that has been instilled in us, meaning, a religion in one sense? Is it memes, a kind of a mind virus? Is it an active form of mind control that certain individuals are taken, if you will, and they're convinced of a certain point of view or idea or a philosophy, and then they're kind of let back down to the planet and run amok, if you will? Or how do you see that, the interface, if you will?
Well, that to me is probably about the most interesting question of this whole thing. And this will be a fairly long answer. I hope you'll forgive me for that. I sometimes get kind of long-winded. When you go back to ancient times, there the contact was very open. In earliest ancient Egypt, they actually built houses for them. They said that these ETs actually lived in the houses. They were fed. They were taken care of. Then you have the tribe that left from the Mesopotamian region, which is the old tribe of Abraham. They said, yeah, we're still directly, visibly interacting, except because here's this light in the sky, and they're telling us giving us these philosophies, and they're commanding us to go and to the Promised Land and go to war with the people in the Promised Land, so we can take back the Promised Land. So you have those reports of this direct, open contact. Now, but I think the Old Testament's significant in one way, in that the contact became a little bit more exclusive and a little bit more hidden. You see a shift. The shift seemed to happen here at this Tower of Babel story, and I can't put a date on the Tower of Babel. I mean, they've found remains in Babylonia where they think it might have been, and some archaeologists have put a date on when they think that was. But after that, you have them going a little bit more into the background, where there's still a connection. There's still a connection with a certain elite. They're a religious elite, which is also a political elite at the same time. Going to the mountaintop, for example, most of the population weren't allowed to go. Only a few of the elite would go, and these elite would then get the message. They'd come back down and say, okay, well, we've got our message now from Jehovah. So, we're to do this or we're to do that. Unfortunately, sometimes it involved going to war with somebody.
Yeah.
Then you have it becoming more, but then you have these societies, these secret societies, which grew out of all of this. They started off with the symbol of the apron, which was a symbol of the modern Masons. And you see the gods, the human-like gods, depicted in ancient Egyptian drawings wearing these aprons. They were said to be the grand masters, the leaders of these secret societies. These secret societies then became the channel through which these different conflicting religions emerged. Jesus may very well have been a member of one of these organizations. He was accused actually of having studied in Egypt and having had an Egyptian education in some of these mystery schools that grew out of these networks. So what happened was that there was a network of these secret societies that formed, and they became then the source of these conflicting ideologies all throughout history, even up until today. You're still going to find evidence even today. And so the theory is that to me is the point of contact in my theory, is that it's through these secret societies that have had political influence, that at some deep level, at some hidden level, where they talk about hidden masters, or they keep their leadership secret, who knows where their leaders might be, and eventually they talk about, well, ultimately our leaders are these cosmic beings or these entities that are not quite human. That's where I think the main point of contact has been. And you find, for example, intelligence agencies are probably the major fomenter of wars today, in my opinion. You're almost going to find an intelligence agency behind any war, kind of behind the scenes helping to get it going, to keep them going. And the lines between the enemies are not always that finely drawn when you get into this murky world of secret intelligence. But what you find there, though, is that they operate as secret societies. Do they have a direct UFO connection? There I have no proof because I haven't really studied it. But I can only point to areas like Area 51, like there's a similar area in Puerto Rico where the U.S. has a base, and perhaps other parts of the world. I haven't studied Area 51 really strongly, but you get reports of UFOs or UFO-like craft. Now, some of them are probably experimental military craft, but some appear to be just traditional UFOs. So there may be that type of point of contact still happening in a remote area, in a secret area, with only a very few who then have the connections or the influence to affect foreign policies of the different countries that then engage in a war. Now, that's very speculative what I'm talking about. I admit it. I'm really speculating now, but I base it going back to the Bible stories, of Jehovah appearing in the distance, where people can see them, but they can't make direct contact, and only a very small number can. So we seem to have a little bit of a similar phenomenon with these secret bases where UFOs are reported. But I can't say I've studied it in depth, and I can say absolutely that's what it is. I put it out there as a possibility for somebody maybe to explore a little bit more. So you find that type of connection still happening today. For example, you find, like in the racial separatist movements, you find claims of direct contact to UFOs, or something analogous to it, like white separatists in the United States. Some of them have belonged to, you probably are more familiar with this being in Scandinavia, the Odinism, the god Odin. And then you have like some of the black separatists, like the Nation of Islam, who claim a direct contact, or claim they're basically a UFO religion is what they are, and believe that they are guided in some way by UFOs. And they also preach a black separatist nation. And so you have like a racial division by groups who want to kind of separate the races, which I think is very destructive, fomented, or at least they claim inspiration from UFOs or UFO-like phenomena. Getting to religion, you'd have to really do the study today. For example, you look at what's happening in the Middle East. Okay, the source of Islamic radicalism seems to be the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, a very conservative Islamic country. And here you'd want to look into, okay, well, who are the leaders of the Wahhabi movement? What do they claim? Do any of them claim that they have contact with angels? Do any of them claim any kind of supernatural or strange kind of contact is going on? I can't read the languages, so I'm not sure how much information we can get out of those countries about that. They are fairly secretive. But there's somebody who perhaps can read those languages, who can explore their literature, or explore what they're talking about over there, might find that kind of contact and might see that that is maybe where some of the philosophical inspiration still comes today. And any radical element of any religion, you have to wonder, well, they're more radical leaders. who are a little bit more in the background, are they claiming? Sometimes you say, well, they're just making it up, or they're delusional, they're hallucinating, they're crazy, which might be the explanation.
Right.
But on the other hand, having studied the UFO phenomenon this way, I have to think, well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe there is actually something going on there similar to what we've seen throughout history. But like I wrote in The Gods of Eden, after I finished writing the book, which has been 20 years now, I haven't really actively researched any of this. If I see a book that sort of relates to it, I'll pick it up and read it. If I see an article, I'll save it. So my look into it now is a little bit more passive. But these thoughts have occurred to me more recently when I look at what's going on today.
Absolutely. And one thing, William, that I really like about the book as well is you go into the history and if we look at the various levels of division that has happened even within the the Christianity then that we potentially in one way or another have been given by this ET, and if that is the ultimate goal, as you mentioned, to constantly divide humanity in different sections and different secret societies or groupings and have these fighting with each other over the power, if that is the goal, that they certainly have achieved it. Again, if we look at history, you go in a little bit to on the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, these other kind of sects that I haven't heard about before, like the Friends of God, and even tying into that, obviously we have the whole Protestant Reformation of Luther, and then the Jesuits come on the scene and they start fighting, and it goes on and on and on like that all the time, right, William?
It's endless. It's absolutely endless, and that's really the point of the whole book, is that each of these religions, they all have some good points to them, by the way. I have some very good friends who are Christians, and I respect and admire their belief, but they believe the good parts of the religion. But there's so much of this that, it breeds dissension, it breeds strife, it breeds division. And it just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And you think, well, geez, there's got to be some reason for this besides we're just a bunch of crazy people. Maybe that's the explanation. But like I said, you dig a little deeper, you peel back the onion layers, and you find that there's motive to some of this. Somebody profits from this. Somebody actually feels that they have a benefit by people fighting each other endlessly. The most obvious is the financial profit that comes from going to war. I call these people the king rats, the humans who financially profit, who have a financial stake in selling weapons, in making loans to governments to fight wars. Yeah, they have a stake, but what I feel that the Gods of Eden talks about is that there's one layer even behind that, and that the king rats, based upon that movie called The King Rat, that's where I got the idea for that term. That behind them, there's this other layer where there's somebody else or something else profiting from this, even bigger and beyond what the human elites would profit from by selling weapons or making loans. And so I think that may be part of the key to this whole thing, and maybe why we're not able to solve it, because we're not really seeing that part of it, not really understanding it. And I can't claim that even if my theory has some truth to it, that even I totally understand the dynamics of it either at this point. There just seems to be maybe evidence of a crime, maybe evidence of a suspect, but I'm not sure that I have discovered or anybody's totally discovered exactly the whole dynamic going on with that. Absolutely.
And how much can we attribute the royal elite families from this as well? If we go back to the the pharaonic lines, if you will, of Egypt and even further back than that, we've always had this kind of idea, or they have had this idea rather, that they are, they're ruling by divine right and so forth. We have a potential ET and human interface, if you will, in the royalty of the world. Can you talk a little bit about that, William?
Yeah. You go back to the old royalty from ancient times, and there was a direct connection that they claimed to have, that the royalty were directly answerable to these human-like gods. They took instruction from these human-like gods. These human-like gods were always said to love to engage in breeding and genetic engineering, if we want to interpret the stories that way. And some of the royals were said to be a mix. They were half alien, half human, and that therefore gave them a stronger claim to being royals. And so the royal families would then go down that line. They talked about the blue-skinned people in the ancient Hindu religions. They were also said to be descended from or of that race, the extraterrestrial race. So you have this constant idea of that there was somehow a special lineage to these extraterrestrials that was more than just loyalty or obedience. It was actually by genetics. Again, most people write that off as just being a mythology. It's just a way to justify being in power. You have to kind of make yourself more special to justify being royalty. You know, hey, I'm not just a human being like you, just a regular old human being. I've got something special in my blood, which empowers me to rule over you. It makes me more special than you, which is, in a way, well, it's a silly idea, even if there's some truth to an ET connection. Yeah. But anyway, that's part of what it might be. But again, the older creation stories talked about an actual genetic connection there, and that justified them then ruling over human society, but at the behest of these other ETs who were flying around in their spacecraft.
It's obviously, William, we might be talking about different races of ET as well. You know, we have a reptilian faction. It seems like we have these gray aliens, which have been suspected by some people even to have a kind of a robot nature almost to them, if you will. They might be the handlers or those who handled the affairs of another race. But what we see it from our point of view is that these are if you know what I mean. And you mentioned the blue skinned as well. So again, we could be in a horrible mess, if you will, here, William. We might be looking at many different factions out there that are maybe not competing, but one way or another trying to influence us from various points of view. I don't know, have you researched any of this further? And if so, what's your take on it today?
Yeah, certainly when you look at the UFO phenomenon and what people have reported in the abduction scenario, and even in the contactee scenario when there seems to be some legitimate contactee activity going on, you find the different races. You find the little gray, that's the one that we're most familiar with. You find some people report a reptilian, taller type of entity that seem to be a little bit more in command, even over the little gray ETs. So you have that aspect to it, and you find both actually depicted thousands of years ago in some of the old artwork, like in ancient Yugoslavia. You find depictions of what look exactly like the little gray ETs, and also in some of the older Sumerian, you find some reptilian type things depicted there as well. So, and then also you have what they call the Nordics, which are the fair-haired human-like types, and I think Dr. Jacobs is now talking about a hybrid type entity now, kind of a mix between human and maybe somewhat the little gray type. So we have that aspect to it. But what I think is happening, and certainly there could be conflict. I think personalities are different within human society. I think personalities are different within those societies. Or maybe it's just one big society that's visiting here. And not everybody is necessarily malevolent, not necessarily everybody is good. You're going to find just a whole range of motivations, and I think that comes out even in the abduction phenomenon, that you find some people that are not, or some entities that are not as malevolent perhaps as others, and that perhaps would like to see human beings improve and really maybe have that wish. The thing is that there's a certain perhaps political structure that surrounds Earth. It's bigger than Earth. It surrounds us, and it's being respected by everybody out there, so to speak. That, in other words, you look at a country that has a colony here on Earth. I talked about the English having a colony in somewhere. And the other countries, even though they may not like how the English are necessarily running that colony, or maybe it was the French colonies or the Belgian colonies, you have other countries who may not like how they are running that colony, and they may even sometimes be allowed to go in there and explore, but they're not going to interrupt that political structure. They're not going to go in there necessarily and undo it. They will respect the colonizers and the colonizers' political organization, even if they don't agree with it. And I think that might be perhaps part of the answer here, that we see a variety of motivations from these apparent ETs. But the structure is left intact. And there's, I believe, some evidence that the structure is still intact even today, even though maybe some people don't like it out there.
I hear from other researchers often that if ET would, if they had a wish to either destroy humanity or take over the planet or what have you, then the answer I get often is, well, if they had that in mind, they would already have done that kind of thing. But that might not be the case at all. Obviously, I mean, we could be talking about a very, very slow form of colonization, if you will, in one sense, or a very slow form of eradicating the human being overall. It could be that, as you suggested before, William, that this piece of property, if you will, the Earth, the planet, is very rare. So therefore, that might be the price, if you will, and that might be the reason for why they want to have us out of here. So what we potentially could be witnessing here is a very slow, part or plan in terms of the colonization, William.
Well, I think you've hit on a very good point, is that, yeah, there are two good points here. A is that if you're just wanting to hold on to the planet just as a possession, yeah, you're not necessarily going to wipe out everybody. You're content just to have them living there and interacting and doing whatever else they do, as long as you have control, as long as they can't rise up against you, as long as they can't go into outer space and pose a challenge to you further out. You could be very content just to sort of hang on to things. You just sort of manage things, just kind of keep them going, keep them riled up. And it could go on for thousands and thousands of years because, they may have a very different concept of time, a very different lifespan, a very different way of experiencing time. It's like how we experience time is very different than how a housefly experiences time, or a dog experiences time. We experience it very differently based upon our lifespans, and therefore how we plan out the future, how we conduct ourselves will be very different depending on that perception of time and experience of time. So we have that, but then I do think, one thing that's kind of caused me concern is that I think we are maybe headed for another wipeout here. The ancient stories talked about human beings being wiped out during the Great Flood. It was basically an attempt to eliminate humanity at that point. Humanity gotten too troublesome, too much of a pain to deal with. And our anthropologists have discovered that there's a genetic bottleneck where there were only maybe a thousand or a few thousand people left on Earth.
That's right.
From which we expanded. So there's evidence that there's been these apocalyptic type events where humanity gets wiped out. I talk about one that was the Black Death.
Yeah,
I think
very interesting.
It was one of those events. Now that only 25 to 50% of the population was wiped out, but there was a very strong UFO connection in terms of the UFO reports at that time. Where there seemed to be an attempt by this society to basically wipe out a very sizable portion of humanity. I'm concerned that we may be getting set up for that again. Okay, call out the psychiatrist now and treat me for saying this anyway. But I base this on the work of Dr. Jacobs, and he talks about how in his research that this whole experimentation factor where the sexual, or I should say reproductive experimentation happening with the abductees aboard the UFO, that it's not just experimentation, it's part of a really major program to actually create this whole hybrid race. And apparently it's been going on, by his estimation, for at least several decades. So you wonder, well, if that's true, how many of these are there out there? Now, I think maybe even on the interview he did with you, and I certainly heard it on the interviews that he's done with others, is that starting in 2003, he says that some of the abductees that he's hypnotized have talked about that now there's actually an integration starting to happen. That they're actually being integrated into society, and now the abductees are being used to teach them how to use telephones, how to drive cars, how to do all of these things that we know how to do. Now, Dr. Jacobs thinks that, okay, this is just more of an integration that will kind of coexist. They will be in control, but we'll still be here. What worries me, though, in the testimony that he's gotten is that they talk about that there's going to be this great cataclysm, there's going to be this great catastrophe that's going to happen on Earth. And my point is that, okay, if that's the case, obviously it's not going to affect them. It's not going to be like a meteor is going to hit the Earth and wipe it out. It's not going to be, there's going to be a big volcano that they're aware of. It's something that's only going to affect human beings. It's not going to affect these hybrids that are being integrated. Otherwise, they wouldn't integrate right now.
Yeah.
They would wait. And then some of these abductees are being taught crowd control. They're being taught how to control large, I'm not sure exactly what kind of crowd control that is. So what this tells me is that this could be another replacement scenario. And one thing I didn't talk about in the Gods of Eden that's true about the plagues that I talked about that had a UFO connection, and something that's come more foremost to my mind now, is that most of these plagues, including the Black Death, began with a famine. There's evidence of famine prior to the plagues. And what's occurring right now is, our food supply is being narrowed down. We're starting to lose our pollinators, which means, maybe about a third of the foods we grow right now won't be much available to the human population. What will survive, though, are grains. Grains don't need pollinators, and grains are being genetically modified, and they're falling into the hands of fewer and fewer hands.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen, I think, here within if these trends continue, and I certainly hope they don't continue, but if they continue, what's going to happen is I think the human food supply is going to be very narrowed down. We're going to be mostly down to a diet of genetically modified grains, which are in the control of very few hands. And when that happens, it'll be very easy to pull the plug very abruptly on the human food supply. All of a sudden, one year, these companies that provide everybody with the grains just suddenly won't be able to do it. Hey, we don't have the seeds to plant this year. And you don't have to believe in UFOs to be concerned about this trend, by the way.
That's right.
I think everybody should be concerned about this trend, whether they believe anything I've said or not. But anyway, that was basically the inability to grow food was a precursor to these wipeout events that I talk about connected to the UFO phenomenon, like the Black Death, and even going back earlier in history, the old biblical stories about the plagues, and part of it involved famine. So, I kind of put it together, and it's sure speculation, but now the hypothesis is that we're being set up for that basically human beings will be wiped out, and then whatever this hybrid races that's being created, they will be put in to replace us. And it won't be obviously a very pleasant experience for any of us. So anyway, again, it's sure speculation, but I'm concerned about that, and I hope, of course, that I'm totally wrong on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, the dots are like incredibly eerie, to connect in this way when you think about it, and the human food supply again is a big one. We hear about the stories of the seed vaults, of course, where they now are locking away the truly genetically diverse seeds, and while we here on the surface, if you will, are given these very, very weak seeds in terms of their genetic diversity. Even the CDC, I think it was recently, William, who had his totally in a serious way kind of had a blog article on their home site or website about that America needs to prepare for some kind of a zombie apocalypse, I think they called it. I don't know if you saw that. It's like these kinds of things are very strange. And then you take into account the radiation leaking out from Japan. We have all these, the BP oil spill that various people around the world are beginning to, it's almost like the people who have been put in charge have been so incredibly bad at their job, so to speak. So it's almost like one suspects that it was like meant to happen. Do you know what I mean? And this is the initiator of this, the culling of the herd, if you will, William. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and you have to wonder, maybe they really are that greedy and that incompetent. Maybe that is the answer, because that is the answer to most people. This whole idea of the ET in the background of all this, of course, is pretty wild stuff. But here's the thing. If this is going on, if the speculation is true, these so-called elites who are putting away the seeds and all that, they're not going to be spared. If you're replacing one species with another species, you're just going to wipe out the whole old species, except maybe to put a few examples in the zoos. Now I'm thinking about the old Twilight Zone stories.
Right.
Okay, yeah, I know. It's funny how my thinking is. I sometimes thinking, oh my God, this is just bad science fiction that we're talking about here.
well, you know.
But I'll tell you that there's evidence for it. That's what's so scary about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Williams,
they're not going to survive. They might survive an extra 6 months or a year.
Yeah.
But they're not going to survive beyond that, because then the next step is maybe some plague or something else. There's some other way to wipe out the remnants, and that's all that they would be.
Right, and again, that suggests then that even though the elite, if you will, and the people in charge of big business and the war machines and what have you might be in a position right now where they either have been convinced in some way to go along with this, or be there unwittingly just the participants of this, or they think they might in some way end up on the have the upper hand in this situation in one way or another. But I think you're right. I think that these will be taken out as well, if you will, and they will just have been participatory in the eradication of the human being as we know them anyway. But some of these ideas is even coming through in some of the television series, if you will, out there running currently. Like The Event even had this hybrid now that is being able to deal with the virus that the rest can't, and then this kind of ET race is have an interest in eradicating the human being. So it's pretty interesting. It's there, it's in the mainstream in one way or another, actually.
Yeah, it is interesting. I haven't seen The Event. I'll have to go rent that. But yeah, you find in Hollywood and on TV some of these themes. They're reading about it. The script writers, they like to read about UFOs, especially if they're writing in science fiction genres. And so yeah, some of these themes will make it, and they'll make it onto the big screen. And it is quite interesting, like you say.
So how close do you think we are to something like this? Are we in the final cusp of this thing? Is it going to unfurl pretty soon? What's your hunch? Because that's all we have to go on, I guess, at this point, William.
Yeah, it's strictly a hunch. I used to think it would probably, if it's true, and again, I do caution people. This is hypothesis. This is theory. I don't have the ET manual on how to do this. Okay, it's just sort of trying to connect dots as best as possible. I used to think probably by the middle of this century, like within the next 30, 40 years. But things are moving rapidly now. The pollinator problem, I think, is really worrisome. Maybe as soon as 10 years. I hope it wouldn't be that soon, because then there'd be more time to try to do something about it. But this is what I say to look for, if this theory is true, is look to the Central Valley of California. Now, the Central Valley of California is where the United States grows probably the majority of its nuts, its fruits, well, not necessarily its fruits, but they grow a lot of fruits and a lot of vegetables here. Almost everything in California's Central Valley requires pollinators. They require that they truck in the bees to pollinate them. As soon as you start reading that the growers of almonds and walnuts in the Central Valley or any other produce have had to tear up their orchards and replace it with corn because they don't have the pollinators anymore to pollinate their crops, that's when the end is near, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the signs to look for when you start reading about that. Hopefully that day will never come, and we'll solve this whole colony collapse disorder problem. But so far it hasn't been solved, and it still seems to keep going.
Yeah, I know. So are you, what side of the fence are you on, William, as we begin to round things up here for the first hour? Or do you feel positive about the future, or do you have a negative outlook right now? Well,
here's the thing. Anything can be changed. The technical solutions to every problem that we're facing right now are actually very easy. We can solve our economic problems very easily from a technical point of view. The problem of the food supply, it was simple to solve. I mean, we grow a lot more food today than we did a century ago, and there's no reason why we can't keep doing it. So from that point of view, I'm optimistic. I don't see anything inevitable in any of this, simply because it's all solvable. The only pessimism I have is the fact that the intention to keep doing these things still seems to be the effective intention. It still seems to be the thing that's driving events. And so if whoever is driving these events can be reached and say, hey, look, guys, you need to change your minds about some of this stuff, it can be solved overnight practically. And life on Earth can be actually a lot of fun and very enjoyable. I mean, human existence can actually be very, very good. So from that point of view, I'm optimistic. But I don't see that is happening quite yet. I do see a lot more discussion about some of these things. I see a lot of people are concerned about the food issue and GMOs and all of that. I think that's all very good. That gives me some hope. So I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know which way it will wind up going. Things can change abruptly and unexpectedly, including for the better. So let's just hope that happens. Let's just keep talking about these things and keep doing what we can do from our different points of view. I mean, I think over there in Europe where you are, I think there's a little bit more resistance by the governments against GMOs, which I think is great. And I hope that continues over there. Here in the United States, boy, we're not doing so good with that. They seem to be letting them in as much as these companies would like them to come in. So there's hope there. But there's only hope if we keep working at it, keep talking about it, and keep trying to do something about it.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, Europe did resist for quite a long time, but the GMO lobbies have certainly been over here right now, and in a lot of countries, and in the EU, obviously, overall, they are going to be let in one way or another, unfortunately, but we can do what we do and, keep informing people that this is very, very detrimental. But we're going to, continue to talk more with you, William, here. A second hour is coming up, and we're going to shift focus over to your latest book now, Jesus Goes to Hollywood. But I want to give out, obviously, your website first, and obviously, again, here, the book title, the main book that we've been talking about here is called The Gods of Eden, and it's available through Amazon, but I think you have it on your website as well, don't you?
Yeah, I have a very small, rather, website. It's you can go there. It's just williambramley.com. It just answers a few questions about me and about the book, but really what I have to say is in the book, so I encourage people to read that.
Absolutely, do that. The Gods of Eden. It's an excellent read, a lot of good history in it as well, and just connecting many of these dots that we've been talking about. So do take a look, williambramley.com.